And even though Cedar Key scrub, as the name implies, is very dry in some of the places, we're going to learn some plants that are specific to that very dry, scrubby stuff. Like most places in Florida, it's really this mosaic of different habitats that can be very, very close together and maybe only a foot or two different in elevation between one spot and another. But just that 1 or 2 feet difference in elevation and just a little bit different underlying sediments makes a completely different kind of flora. And so right here, you can see there's lots of water because this is in a spot in sort of a flat woody type of area, which we'll see when we get there, that has an underlying clay pan, which means it holds water. And so the flora is very different. When you walk up the trail, you can probably see it up here. See how it starts to dry out up here? Different flora, okay, different plants. So we'll be looking at that. And notice that there's a student who's barefoot. Don't do that. The student wanted to be barefoot everywhere, so we just couldn't convince him otherwise. All right, so what is flora? I'm throwing this word around a lot. And why should we care about it? Well, it can mean 2 different things. So the flora is basically all of the plants in a given area. But it also means the book. So sometimes people will say, oh, where's the flora? And they mean this, okay? The book that has the list of plants in an area. And as I mentioned before, knowing the flora actually helps us know something about, in general, that area. So, for example, what other organisms are likely to be found there? So if you understand what animals and birds, etc., are associated with longleaf pine, you know that if you're in a longleaf pine dominated area, then you will be able to find those organisms. And so for people who are really interested in general ecology of an area, this knowing the plants is fundamental to understanding the ecology. It also helps us understand what other stuff is going on that may not be really obvious to your eye. So we know that certain plants will not stand growing in any water, right? So we know if they're there, then there's never going to be any standing water there, or vice versa. It also helps us know something about what we can do to help manage or maintain the habitat, right? So if you know the difference between an invasive species and one that's native, that's a good thing because it helps you to manage that if you want to keep it in a native type of state. We also know, if you can learn the species, you also will get some idea about which ones are going to give you a rash if you touch them, right? So knowing poison ivy is kind of important if you're going to be out and about in Florida. Or which ones might make you very sick or kill you if you ate them. All good things to know. It's also just a lot of fun. And so these are pictures actually taken on Seahorse Key several years ago. On Seahorse Key, we botanized by canoe. So we could go around and learn all the different species of mangroves, etc. there, if you like. And this is actually something I'm going to pose to you later on. I haven't actually set in stone all the dates and locations for our field trips for this semester. One option would be to try and substitute a trip to Seahorse Key for St. Augustine. Do both. But we can talk more about that maybe next week. Whether we'd rather do this or we'd rather go to the beach and learn more of the beach flora. So floristics is a related term. I think that was on one of the slides before. So people who do floristic projects are the people who go to an area, they collect and identify all the species of plants in that area, and then they publish them in a book or in a journal publication, and we call that the flora. So floristics is kind of the process of identifying and listing all the plants. Floristic projects used to be very, very common, not as common anymore. But in order to do floristics, you need to know something about taxonomy, right? And taxonomy is defined here in Judd. Some of you have seen that book, right? The theory and practice of grouping individuals into species, arranging species into larger groups, and giving these groups names, okay? Thus producing a classification. So taxonomists are specialists in looking at plants, really studying them very closely for their characteristics, both large and small, studying them in terms of what time of year that they produce their reproductive features, what those reproductive features look, the whole 9 yards. So it's about really looking at the plants. Now, not all taxonomists agree with one another. So in science, this happens, right? You have different, sometimes you have different results based on your own observations and your own study. And so sometimes there are disagreements in things like floristic treatments and in floras, right? Because one taxonomist might define a species one way, and another taxonomist might define it slightly differently, okay? So sometimes in this class even, we will find situations where one book calls a species this, and another book calls a species something different. And I will try and point those things out when we come to them. So for example, you can also have taxonomists agree about whether something is a species or not. So one taxonomist might consider an entity to be a variety of another species, and another taxonomist might consider it to be a standalone, very good species by itself. And those are the kinds of things that we will encounter in this class, and it's okay. Taxonomists disagree. It can be a little frustrating sometimes for people who are new. Well, what is this called? But we'll try and talk about those things as we go through. Okay, so any one of those groups is also called a taxon, which is how taxonomy is. Now, taxonomy is related to this field called systematics, which I mentioned earlier when I said I'm a bryophyte systematist. So somebody who actually studies the diversity and relationships among those organisms. So those two fields are related because in order to really, the first step in identifying a species and circumscribing it is to understand its characteristics, right? How to look at it, etc. But in order to determine how that species is related to other species, or how that genus is related to other genera, etc., you need to do a study that's slightly different. And so systematics typically relies upon another field called phylogenetics, where you actually take characteristics of organisms, almost always molecular characteristics, DNA sequence data, and you use specific algorithms to make predictions about how they're related to one another. And it produces a tree type of diagram, the hypothesis does when you come up with it. Now, if any of you have taken Bio 1 and Bio 2, you've seen this a lot. And if you've taken other courses in biology, you've already probably seen them a lot too. So I'm not going to go and beat a dead horse, but if you have questions about this, because it's pretty fundamental to understanding evolutionary biology and the relationships among plants. I'll also add that taxonomists and systematists work together a lot. And sometimes people are doing both of these types of things, both describing the diversity you can see and figuring out how they're related to one another. So classifications can be informed by systematics and vice versa. Okay? And sometimes that's the reason why taxonomists disagree. Well, this phylogeny says this, and this phylogeny says this, because there could be different hypotheses based on those kinds of data. We can use the systematics field to discover and describe species. Sometimes it even helps decide where extinct species fit in. It also tells us a lot about evolution, helps us establish classifications, and It helps us study the distribution of organisms across the planet, too, which is biogeography. All right. So in these classification schemes, there's a set of rules that we have to follow to name things. And we're not going to, again, go into a lot of detail about this because you've already learned this starting in like 6th grade or something, right? But did you know that there actually are people that meet every 4 years at the International Botanical Congress to look at these rules and revise them? So every 4 years, the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature Committee meets and they look at these rules. They look at different problems that taxonomists encounter in applying these rules, and they fix them or revise them every 4 years. The ICBN says currently that there are specific endings for our different names depending upon the level of the classification that you're talking about. So the ones that we're going to be dealing with almost exclusively in here are genus and species, right? So we're learning species in this class. But we'll also be hitting every now and then this concept of a family, because there are lots of species that kind of have a general look to them because of their family. And sometimes knowing that is helpful to figure out what the species is. So we may come back to this. I'll always tell you what family it's in on your sheet, so you can take that information for what it's worth later on. But we're mostly going to be dealing with genus and species level classification. And species names are binomial. And this is important because when you respond to a quiz question, like what is this plant, you're going to need to put the binomial species name on your quiz answer. And you need to format it correctly. Okay? So here's how to format it. Acer rubrum is the species here. The genus name is Acer. And the second part of the name, of the binomial name, is referred to as the specific epithet. Now, together, those two words make the species name. So it's not that this is the genus name and this is the species name, right? And that's a common misconception. The whole thing is the species name. This is simply a word that describes which member of the genus it is. So it's the whole thing is the binomial species name. Now, the second part of this name, the specific epithet, is never capitalized, but the genus is always capitalized. And when it's in print, a species name will be italicized. As you can see, it's written up here. When you write it by hand, and you don't have to do this on your quizzes, so just because there's already a line there, okay, you don't have to underline it again. When you write it by hand in a handwritten essay or something like that, the name should be underlined to indicate that it's a species name. There's another thing up here that will be included in the Flora. If you look up a species name in the Flora, the species name will have this extra thing at the end of it. I'll look at this later, but that is the naming authority. So that's the person who first described the species. And it's not italicized, it is abbreviated. Sometimes there will be an additional name following that that's also abbreviated and not italicized. And then the first name will be in parentheses. So what this is a indication that here's the person in parentheses who originally described the species. And then here's the person who revised our circumscription of that species to be slightly different after that. Okay. So who is L period? Linnaeus. You will see this everywhere on all kinds of organisms because he named it all kinds of stuff. That was his whole life's work.
Do you underline the naming authority?
You don't. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so the other thing, which is kind of a pet peeve, is the word species is both singular and plural, okay? So you have one species, two species, three species. So species is not a word, it's species. Just like with, what's another example of that? Fish and fish. Although sometimes people use fishes too, which is not good. But anyway, it's both singular and plural, so don't use the word species. Okay, so, and as I mentioned earlier, classifications using those naming schemes are usually based on phylogeny. Now it's not just usually, but always. And these are different ways that you would see a phylogeny depicted. Now, scientific names sometimes mean stuff and sometimes don't, unfortunately. So, here are some examples of scientific names. I'll let you decide whether they're literal or not. So Toxicodendron radicans actually means poison tree with aerial roots. That's poison ivy. So that's pretty good, right? But Vampyroteuthis infernalis, the vampire squid from hell, probably isn't a vampire and probably isn't from hell. So anyway, so there are all sorts of different ways that people use to describe, to name species. And some of them really are helpful, some of them are not. And then there are a lot of names that are applied as tributes. So there are all kinds of organisms that are named after famous people. Presidents, for example. President Obama has multiple species named after him. President Bush, George W. Bush has multiple species of insects, I think, and spiders named after him.
Wow.
Yeah. And then there's a whole genus of ferns named after Lady Gaga. Do you want to know the story?
Yeah.
Okay. So the story is the scientist who was working on DNA sequence data associated with these ferns noticed that there was a repeat of GA in the nucleotide sequence of the gene he was looking at that defined this genus. In other words, this genus was the only one that had this little insertion of GA in this spot, and everybody else that he was comparing it to didn't have that repeat right there. And so he just started sort of calling it the Gaga fern, right? GA. And then she wore this outfit to one of the music awards, which I don't even remember when that was. But the outfit looked a whole lot like a gametophyte of a fern. And so the name kind of stuck, and he actually decided to name the genus formally after Lady Gaga. And there's one species that has her last name involved in it, it's Gaga germinata. So, yeah. There's also a bunch of plants named after David Attenborough, we all know and love, I'm sure, for good reasons. So, yeah, they can be tributes as well. So why do we need to learn scientific names instead of common names? If you put a common name on your quiz, you're going to get it wrong, even if it fits, okay? The reason for that is that, of course, you know that, because you also learned this in 6th grade, that gives us a common language to refer to the species as. So regardless of what your native language is, those species are called the same thing, that scientific name in every language. And so we may have common names for these plants that are English names, but if you don't speak English, that doesn't mean anything to you, right? And so there may also be other common names in other languages for that plant. And you can't have a common conversation about it unless you know the scientific names. So those common names vary from region to region. Also, one plant, even in the same language, may have multiple common names, which isn't very helpful either. So in different regions of Florida, you might call an oak, a specific species of oak, 2 different things. And there are also lots of common names that are shared between things that aren't even related. So here's an example. Cedar refers to both our juniperous species as well as the true cedars that are in a completely different part of the world. Okay? And also you will learn that as you learn more species, you find lots of examples where no one ever gave them a common name. So they're overlooked plants, right, that no one uses maybe for a specific thing, or they don't, unless you're a botanist or someone who's interested in the flora, you may not ever learn the plant. So there's no common name for it at all. So that's why learning the scientific names is important. All right. So before we talk about this, are there questions about that stuff we just talked about? The scientific names, or just taxonomy, systematic definitions, what we use them for, what we care. Okay. So what you're looking at here is one hypothesis for the phylogeny of the land plants. Okay? And the reason why I'm showing it is because I want to just briefly walk through the major groups of land plants, a couple slides, so that we have some common ideas to refer to when we see these different groups of plants out in the field. And when I say one hypothesis for this, it's because there are actually multiple hypotheses for how the land plant groups are related to one another. There have been lots of different studies using very good data that come up with different answers. And so the relationships among some of these groups is still an open question for some. But basically, these three groups down here, the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts, are bryophyte groups. And the bryophytes are typically very small organisms that don't have conducting tissue. So they don't have the pipes, the xylem and phloem, to move water and food throughout the body. Instead, they use diffusion and osmosis to move things around. And they have a whole bunch of really cool genetic adaptations that allow them to withstand drying out because they don't have this type of tissue. So they sort of went a different direction in their adaptation pathway that enables them to withstand drying out rather than retaining and conducting water. These groups, the rest of these groups up here, the lycophytes, monilophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms do have vascular tissue. That's the sort of pipes that move water and food through the body. These two groups, the lycophytes and monilophytes, are spore-producing plants. These are too, but these are the spore-producing plants that also have vascular tissue. And these groups up here produce seeds, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms don't make flowers and fruits, and angiosperms do. So that's what these hash marks refer to. So that's just kind of a general guideline of how these groups differ from one another. So here's a couple of photographs of bryophytes. Here's some lycophytes.